that it's shared. Okay. Okay, we're all good to go. So hi everyone who joins in today. I want to introduce you all to Maria Lewis. Thanks so much, Maria, for joining us. So Maria is an author, screenwriter and journalist based in Melbourne, Australia, and getting her start as a police reporter. Her writing on pop culture has appeared in publications such as New York Post, Guardian, Penthouse, the Daily Mail, Empire Magazine, Gizmodo, Huffington Post, the Daily and Sunday Telegraph, Junkie, and many more. So that's certainly very impressive. Previously seen as a presenter on SBC Viceland's nightly news program, The Feed, and as a host on Cleaver Fan on ABC. She has been a journalist for over 16 years. And her best-selling debut novel, Who's Afraid, was published in 2016, followed by its sequel, Who's Afraid 2, in 2017, which was nominated for Best Horror Novel at the Aquarius Awards in 2018. Who's Afraid is being developed for television by the Emmy and BAFTA award-winning Hoodlum Entertainment, and her young adult debut, It Came from the Deep, was released globally in October 31st, Halloween 2017, which is a twist on The Little Mermaid meets Creature from the Black Lagoon. Her fourth book, The Witch Who Courted Death, was released on Halloween 2018 and won Best Fantasy Novel at the Aurelius Awards.
Aurealis.
in 2019, and her fifth novel, set within the shared supernatural universe, The Wailing Woman, was nominated for Best Fantasy Novel in 2020. She was the host of the limited podcast series Josie and the Podcats about the 2001 cult film. And her latest book is The Rose Daughter, which I've just finished reading. I'd say I don't normally read this genre, but I did find it a good read.
Hang on, let me bring up. We can join pairs.
I did see that it said it was in a series. Is that right? And just wanted to know, like, I haven't read any of your others, but I don't think it took away anything from not reading the others. What would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, I mean, you just read out the title of all the other books in that series. So the idea is that you can pick up any book in the Supernatural Sisters series, and that can be your entry point into the world. I don't want to exclude anyone. I want to try and invite new readers in, but at the same time, for people who've, say, been reading from Who's Afraid onwards, there's like lots of little Easter eggs, and the main character of The Rose Daughter, Directly Jones, for instance, she pops up a few books ago, just as like a tertiary character. So the idea is like anyone can be the main character of their own story. It's just about whether they have the time and the space and the volume for that to happen. So I think, I mean, the idea is that you can jump in at any point, but if you do like The Rose Daughter and you found it interesting and you found the world interesting, the good news is that there's 6 other books in the series earlier, so you can stay playing in that world for a little bit longer, and then the series will wrap up on book 8, which comes out this time next year, basically.
Okay, sounds good. And just for people watching as well, just to let you know, if you ask a question during the Facebook Live, thanks to Hatchet, we do have a copy of The Rose Daughter to give away, so please type your questions and comments to Maria. What could you tell me maybe why you decided to write a series, and how you just mentioned that the last one's coming out after this? How do you decide when to end the series as well?
I think it's a combination of sort of gut instinct and story instinct as well. Like, I think you know when it feels right. Also, like, 8 books into a series, that's quite a decent chunk, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like I've had a good run, and I know how fortunate I am to A, get to finish a series at all, B, get to finish the series on my own terms, and C, finish it with the same publisher and the same editor that I started with, you know, back in 2014. So it felt like the right time, and also each of the books sort of focuses on a different woman, a different type of main character. Directly Jones, for all intents and purposes, is a woman in her 40s, and other characters are women in their late teens. Some are in their 20s, some are in their 30s. Some of them are from different racial backgrounds. Some of them have limb differences and disabilities. Some of them have all different types of supernatural abilities and gifts that might make them quote unquote monstrous under certain views and certain eyes. So I had always had plans for a larger world when I first wrote Who's Afraid. But obviously, like, if Who's Afraid had only been read by my mum, then you don't get to have a series, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have a readership, you don't get to keep going on. So the fact that people read Who's Afraid and then read Who's Afraid 2 meant that I get to keep expanding the world. And I had originally pitched The Witch Who Courted Death, which was my fourth book, with Who's Afraid, but that character is a bisexual woman in her 30s with a limb difference. And back in 2014, that was too much diversity. Not my words from other people who make decisions about money, but that was a little bit like pushing the envelope too far. And Who's Afraid was a biracial main character. And that was kind of like as far as they were willing to go back then. But by the time it came around again, like I had the next book ready, due on the contract, a few things like Mad Max Fury Road, Kingsman Secret Service, Winter Soldier, Captain America Winter Soldier. There have been a few other examples of mainstream commercially successful projects that had characters with limb differences in them. And suddenly that looked like a more viable option from a publisher's point of view. And it meant that I had the opportunity to keep expanding the world further. And thankfully, they've been keen to let me keep doing that, because I find that really fascinating. You know, like getting to do The Wailing Woman, for instance, my fifth book, was about banshees. And I haven't read that many stories about banshees. There's some out there, and there are a few pop culture examples as well, and things like Marvel Comics and DC Comics. But there really aren't as many as I would like, considering that it's a mainly female-centric supernatural being. Like I want to read a bunch of stories about banshees, not just like 3. So that was something that was really fun to tap into, and I wouldn't have gotten to keep doing that if they'd shut the series down, you know, several books earlier.
Yeah. So how did you decide though that now is the end?
It felt right. It felt like gut instinct, and it felt like storytelling instinct. You know, as I mentioned, like, this is the 8th book in the series, and it's, you know, it is rare that people get to A, finish a series at all, and, you know, B, finish it at their publisher and with their same editor. I've worked with Anna Boatman from the very beginning, and I feel very fortunate that I've got to keep working with her the whole way through. My publisher is based out of the UK, and so is most of the editorial team that I work with. So I know how rare that is, and it just feels like, and I think for people who've read The Rose Daughter, they will probably agree, hopefully agree, that it feels like the next logical conclusion, right? Like, it's been a culmination over almost a decade now of lots of different types of women and lots of different stories coming together. And we're at that point where you've kind of earned it. So I'm looking forward to, well, I've already submitted the book. I was going to say, I'm looking forward to paying it off. But, you know, I really enjoyed writing it, because it was like a lot of ducks that I had lined up super early on, and just getting to do like a lot of payoff was super satisfying. I like things with a bow on it. Not like necessarily to say things have a happy ending. I think there's a delicate balance between giving the readers what they want versus what they need. But there is definitely satisfaction to me in ending a story on your own terms, which is, very fortunate, I feel. Very blessed.
And do all the characters from the previous books feature in your last book?
Yeah, I'm kind of calling it Maz Venus. Not realistically, but it is a little bit like Avengers Assemble. It's a chapter from Tommy's perspective, a chapter from Dreckley's perspective, a chapter from Casper's perspective, and a chapter from Sadie's perspective. So the book alternates between the 4 views. And I think that's great too, because it gives, for people who are fans of all those separate characters, it's giving them their favorite character and getting to spend time with that character, but also all the supporting characters that people get attached to in their world, whether that's, you know, their paramours or their partners or their foes or their enemies. And it also was really, really fun getting to write the different women's perspectives on the other women. You know, like Casper and Tommy have crossed over a lot together, and Sadie and Casper have crossed over a lot, and Sadie and Dreckley have crossed over a lot. But having the four of them there crossing over and their worlds interconnecting, some of those interactions, I mean, that's stuff I've been looking forward to writing for like 8 years, you know. It's very satisfying to get to do it finally.
And we've got quite a few people watching, which is great. And I've got some
Hi,
questions coming through, so I'll read out some of the questions.
This is the most fun I've had all week. I'm in lockdown. God.
We're making your day, your night.
You're making my month at this point.
So Tony wonders if any of your characters are based on some of the characteristics of people you might have met during your life.
Oh, 100%, yes. Sometimes it's specific women and specific women and specific characters linking up. For instance, the witch from The Witch Who Courted Death is this character called Opal. That's her pseudonym. Her real name is Carla Tully, but she's inspired by a friend of mine, Rudawee Heck, and that's inspired in physicality and sort of her personality as well. You know, like, okay, obviously Rudawee's not a witch, so spoilers there, but it is very much the basis for that type of character and the type of women that I wanted to project. Character of Casper as well from The Witch Who Courted Death was an amalgamation of inspirations, but partially inspired by my friend Angel Guy-Fiera, who's a bionic actress, and another friend of mine who unfortunately passed away, Quentin Kinahan, who was a big disability activist and actor within the community. And it was sort of a mix of things that we had talked about in discussions in terms of representing characters with difference, and things that they hated, stereotypes that they hated, things that they loved, things that they hadn't seen, wanting to have characters that were disabled who had sexual agency and got to have romantic storylines and storylines that weren't just entirely about their disability, stuff like that. So a lot of times it is inspired by people I know, or inspired by discussions that I've had, certain characters. In The Rose Daughter, actually, though, there is a character, Katya, who is a literal person. In the book, she's a goblin who's like a manicurist. She's like a supernatural nail technician. And in real life, she is also a nail technician, although not a goblin. But her exact physicality, the green bangs, the baubles in the hair, the whole thing is taken from Katya in real life. And that was kind of like a little treat. I told her one day that I was like, oh, could you care if I like wrote you into the book? And she's like, yes, that would be amazing. Can you write me as like something crazy? And I was like, a goblin? I got you. Because in my world, goblins are very technically skilled creatures, right? Anything that involves something very specific and a certain attention to detail, that's sort of their forte. So a nail technician is totally that. And so that's kind of the only like real person that's in there is Katya. If you ever want to check out her nails, Claws by Katya on Instagram, that's Claws with a K. Her work is amazing. You will totally understand why I wrote her into a book. Her stuff is incredible.
And you've said about writing like people who have disabilities and that are your characters. Is there something that drew you to wanting to write about people with disabilities?
Well, so when I was 22, I had a stroke, and it meant that like a mini stroke. It's called like a TIA. And essentially from that point onwards, there's just like a lot of things about my life that changed, and not visibly. It's in many ways like an invisible disability, right? The chronic pain, the fatigue, the migraines, stuff like that. They're not things that can be viewed outwardly. They're all things that you deal with inwardly. But it was just something that sort of, I had been connected with other young stroke survivors through the Stroke Foundation of Australia. And my world expanded a little bit more in terms of I was, you know, dealing with people who were the same age group as me, you know, in their 20s, and dealing with this stuff and dealing with the sort of like the public assumptions and the personal assumptions, and trying to sort of like readjust your limits. You know, it was something that I was really grappling with at the time. But with every book, I have wanted to try and sort of purge characters from the margins, purge types of women that you mightn't get to see. Like even The Rose Daughter, having a main character in their 40s for a supernatural story and like a genre story is quite unusual. And I was like, I wanted to read that. Why wouldn't you want to read that? That's interesting to me. There's a character called Shazza who is in all of the books, and she's in her 50s. I kind of describe her as like a silver-haired Lara Croft, and she's a bodybuilder and a wombat shifter. And I'm like, that's dope. Like, I know a few bodybuilders in their 50s. They're not exactly the inspirations for Shazza, but like, fuck yeah, who wouldn't want to see that? Like, that's really interesting to me. And same with Tommy, you know, I wanted from Who's Afraid 2, and Who's Still Afraid. I wanted like, what better sort of methodology is there to talk about like mixed race identity than werewolfism, where there's something that you are by day and something that you are by night, and using that as a vessel to talk about female rage and like anger, and like women having to be like these like quote unquote meek, reserved things. And we have a lot of I don't know, maybe not you, but I have a lot of aggression. I have a lot of anger. I know I look sweet in a fucking love heart, you know, jumper and stuff, but I'm someone who has a lot of rage sometimes about a lot of things. And getting to write a character that is the vessel for that was really important. And Sadie in The Wailing Woman, she's a character who communicates through Auslan throughout the duration of that book. And that again was something that it was just like, we haven't seen that enough times in popular fiction, and why not? You know, that's an extremely common thing. There are a lot of people who use sign language every single day in their lives, and where are they represented in fiction? So it's a combination of, I guess, it needing to be right for the story, but also it being something that I feel like I haven't seen, and, you know, why haven't we seen it?
Yeah. And have you found with you writing about people with disabilities and fantasy that has brought out more people doing this, or you're still the only person author you've seen?
I never want to say I started a trend. I feel super awkward or comfortable about that. I think there are many factors, because it has to happen across, like, for these things to be purged from the margins and to not be like niche or specific anymore. A few things need to happen to infiltrate mass culture in that way. And it's usually needs to be like film, it needs to be books, it usually needs to be games, and I would like comic books are like a variation of mediums, right? And there have been characters with limb differences in comic books for a really long time. Unfortunately, a lot of them have been played as villains. You know, characters like, okay, yes, the Winter Soldier, he progresses into a hero, but there are a lot of characters with limb differences in comic books who are villainous of some description, or have like gun legs or gun arms or prostheses that are used as weapons, essentially. But things like Mad Max Fury Road happening, especially a lot of the stuff that's happening on TV with streaming services as well, even things like television shows that are depicting characters as the leads who have autism or have like some kind of disorder that is on the spectrum, that stuff is becoming much more mainstream. And it's about like accumulation of factors rather than, you know, maybe one person having read my book. I think it's just hopefully a lot of different things happening at the same time.
Yeah. And could you tell us a little bit about your TV? So Who's Afraid is being filmed at the moment, or has it just been optioned for TV? Or
no, it was optioned for television in 2016. And so that's currently in development, and legally I can't really talk about anything outside of that. I always feel bad when it comes up in interviews, because I'm like, man, I'd love to tell you some stuff, but I cannot say anything.
Okay. Hopefully we'll be able to see something soon then. Patricia says, what drew you to write in the fantasy genre, and do you read books in this genre by other authors?
Yes, I love fantasy broadly, like just not even in literature, but fantasy films, fantasy games, fantasy anything that's sort of, I think the broad definition is speculative fiction. Anything within that world has always been stuff that I've been drawn to. Like some of the first films and first things I ever remember being obsessed with was stuff like Man Monster Party, Gem and the Holograms, you know, that was the kind of thing that I was immediately connected to and engaged with. So I always loved the genre, and writing in the genre had never really been something that I had thought about before. I was working as a journalist at the time when I first wrote Who's Afraid, which is the first in the series. And when I first started writing Which You Caught a Death, and It Came from the Deep, and Who's Afraid 2, those sort of first 4 books were all the ones that I was writing really heavily while still being a reporter. And it was kind of an unusual choice, I guess you could say, because a lot of my colleagues, ones who did write books, they tended to write nonfiction books, not so much memoirs per se, but it would be a lot of stuff as like a biography or a true crime book of some description, because we wrote about nonfiction. We were nonfiction writers for a living. That was primarily what we dealt with. So writing fiction was really interesting for me because like there were a few things like I didn't do a creative writing course. I didn't go to uni for creative writing or anything like that. I studied journalism, and then I was working as a reporter from when I was 16 onwards. So everything I learned about writing was learned in the field, but it didn't necessarily pertain to creative fiction. So I just tried to write stories that I think that I would have wanted to read, basically. I just wanted to write stories that had all the elements for stuff that I loved. Like, you know, they had horror, they had action, they had romance, they had mystery elements. Those were the things that really drew me to stories in that genre. And so I wanted to have great world building as well, and characters, and like female characters and monsters, and a kind of mix of those elements. That's what I was obsessed with. And so that's what I'd set out to do originally. And, you know, fast forward many years later, I learned a lot thanks to the guidance, I guess, of editors and the editing process, and, you know, reader feedback and things that I enjoy and things that I don't enjoy. And, you know, like Who's Afraid 2, and Who's Still Afraid are all in first person. And if I could go back, I wouldn't make that choice. But
really?
like for your first book, it's like, actually, that's super great, because it means that you're in the head of the character, right? And so for readers who are coming to that world for the first time, it's a fantastic entry point, because you're entering it through this vessel of this character who's speaking to you through their experience and their voice, which kind of makes it a little bit tricky, because Tommy is an antagonistic character in many respects. So she can be like quite painful and insufferable to deal with. But I love complicated and prickly women as well, so that's fun. But there are just like lots of different things. They're like, oh, I maybe would have done that differently. And I'm sure I'll feel that way about choices that I make with, you know, The Rose Daughter, for instance. It's a chapter set in the past and a chapter set in the present. I love that as a device right now. Maybe in 10 years, I'd be like, oh, man, I wish I didn't do that. But right now, I'm like, man, I'm really glad I did that. And also, like, shit, there's a lot of bloody research that goes into that, and making it feel correct and authentic.
Yeah. Well, and talking about research, like a lot of people might think with fantasy, you might not really need any research, but obviously you do. Could you tell us a little bit about what sort of research you did do for The Rose Daughter?
Oh, so much. So as mentioned, it is a chapter in the past and a chapter set in the present, right? So obviously the present, like how much do you need to research? You know, it's present day. Actually, surprisingly quite a lot. And I think because I did come from that nonfiction background, I'm never hesitant to pick up a phone and call somebody for information if I need it. Even stuff like The Witch Who Caught a Death, for instance, it's partially set in Berlin and partially set in Boscastle, which is a specific part of Cornwall. But there are parts of that story that I had to research really thoroughly. And sometimes you do that by going to the place. Sometimes you do that by picking up a phone and calling someone, or in the case of The Witch Who Caught a Death, like I met with several practicing witches, and we talked about their practice and like their beliefs and different elements and aspects to the story. With The Wailing Woman, I researched stuff through the Irish Folklore Commission and accessed old manuscripts about banshees. For The Rose Daughter, the thing that, like, so the main character is a sprite, right? Which isn't a very well-known supernatural creature. There aren't super endless amounts of resources pertaining to that. Based on different mythologies, you know, Sprite is kind of like a mermaid for some cultures. It's kind of like a little pointy pixie in others. It's really sort of open to interpretation, but the core elements tend to be evolved around like the element of air in some capacity and the element of water. So those are the things that I had to play with, and the rest is literally like, you know, what you would imagine speculative fiction. You make parts up. But because there were, her story did go from basically the late 1800s right through to the present. You have chunks that are set in Scotland in that era. Then you have chunks that are set in Los Angeles in the 1920s and the golden age of Hollywood, right? That was really fun to write those chapters because I did a lot of research looking into the archives and interviewing experts in film history at the Australian Centre for Moving Image, ACME, where I also work partially as a film curator.
Okay.
So I had great access there in terms of being able to find people and find resources who could condense that world into something that I could translate into a story that was enjoyable. But also when she progresses in through World War II, I'm suddenly looking into female spies and the practicalities of tradecraft, not just someone who's relying on their abilities. So, for instance, I spoke to Peter Fitzsimmons about that, who's a best-selling award-winning biographer, former rugby league player, but he also did a biography on Nancy Wake, who was known as Judith the White Mouse, very famous Australian British spy. So it was different things like that, like elements that you wouldn't necessarily think, okay, it's a book about sprites.
Yeah.
Like, you know, how much
I wouldn't have
research
thought,
did you do?
yeah, I wouldn't have thought all
Yeah,
that.
even the stuff like directly, she's an identity forger, right? She forges identity documents. And so I contacted several people through various nefarious channels who make fake documents for a living. And I talked to them about not specifics, not clients and stuff like that, but more about what are the practicalities of the job? Like, how do you sell this? Who do you sell it to? What's your price point? Stuff like that. So, you know, I think the best fantasy is grounded in reality. And so if there are elements that are real world, I think the more authentic and well-researched you can make those, then the fantasy feels even more fantastical and special and magical.
Sina is wondering if you have a favorite fantasy author.
Oh my God, Sina, I have so many. It really does depend on because I'm thinking of like Greg Rucka and Nicholas Scott do this amazing series called Black Magic, which is a graphic novel series. A lot of Greg Rucka's sort of more fantastical work I really love. I love Charlene Harris. She's the author of many series, but probably most known to people for the Sookie Stackhouse series. But she also has these books, the Harper Connolly Mysteries, which are absolutely amazing. Just like a lot of her work, I was really obsessed with because she has this ability to pivot between genres that I've always been really obsessed with and always really admired and wished, like, oh man, like somebody give me a deal to like write a murder mystery or something. Or, you know, just like, I love that she's doing a futuristic series here and then she's doing a Southern vampire series here. Yeah, and Rochelle Mead would be another good example of that. She's someone who pivots between a lot of different genres. The Vampire Academy series, which is YA, so young adult, is probably what she's best known for, but she had the series about a succubus that was really great, and then this other series that was sort of set in dual dimensions about fairies, and it was very high concept, sort of almost sword and sorcery fantasy that I really enjoyed. But yeah, they're just like, you can probably see a through line between the types of authors I'm naming. A lot of women, but also like a lot of people are really great at crafting characters that I want to spend time with, even if I don't like them, you know. I just sometimes, like, you just want to spend time with them because they're interesting.
Yeah. Anne's got a question that I've also been thinking as well. She's wondering what you're going to write after you've like you said, you've just finished the last of the series. Will it be more fantasy?
In terms of books?
Yeah.
Well, I have a few different things floating around at the moment. I have a slasher. I love horror movies. It's like one of my favorite things in the world. So I crafted like a millennial scream, if you will. So I have a slasher that's floating around. I have a rom-com that is also floating around. I like to experiment with different genres. I love the world of fantasy, but my other job is I write television, and oftentimes the work that I'm doing in the television space is very fantasy centric as well, and even video games tend to be very fantasy centric. So I quite like having the opportunity to take a little bit of a break from it, because especially by the end of book 8, the only supernatural creature I don't use is vampires, because I didn't have anything original to say. Like, I feel like don't drag up vampires unless you've got a fresh take, right? And I knew people would ask about them, so I was like, oh, they're like the rats of the supernatural world, okay? They're just like in cages and they eat cat bones, and I don't know, man. Let's just like get that to the side. But I basically use every other type of supernatural being that you could imagine, like even the ones that are just like pulled out from very specific parts of folklore, like arachnia, which are these basically essentially giant spider people from Japanese folklore, and lots of different cultures have versions of them. But I used it all. Like there's no toys left in the toy box. So I think for me, I want to take a wee bit of a break from the fantasy world until I have something left to say, I guess. I feel like it's like by the end of the series, Supernatural Sister series, it's just like you've been yelling for a really long time, and then you're like, oh my God, I have no voice left. Like I have no fantasy voice left right now. Like give me a year's break. And that will be a different story, which is also part of it. You know, I have a book coming out once a year, sometimes twice a year, every year for like the past 8 years. That's a crazy turnaround. And so, you know, just the research and the sort of like world building and the thinking and the planning and the plotting that you have to do, I'm a wee bit spent. So like just having that opportunity to have like a little bit of space, and in television, it's enjoyable because it's oftentimes you're hired not on your idea, you're hired on someone else's idea. So it's really fun to be like, hey, come in and like suggest some stuff. And I'm like, oh boy, would I love to. When it, you know, the stakes aren't quite, not want to say quite as high, but it's not all on you, you know?
Yeah. Kelly's wondering if you have a favourite supernatural being.
I get asked this question a lot, and I think it really depends on when you ask me. But consistently, I would say to Kelly that it's werewolves. Werewolves have always been my favourite. The part of New Zealand that I grew up in, Arrowtown, which is, we were just talking about off camera, which is just a little bit outside of Queenstown. It's a place that more people would know. But it's quite rural area. Like in winter, I used to look out the windows and it would be, you know, snow everywhere and mountains and stuff like that. And my granddad always used to tell me stories about like the farm down the road. There'd been a werewolf attack and there were wild dogs in the air. Like it sounds really messed up now when you look back on it, but you're like, I don't know. Okay. And there were wild dogs in the area who would attack the livestock, right? So you would sometimes find animals half eaten, or you would hear dogs barking or howling or running around and stuff. So for like a huge chunk of time, like growing up, I thought werewolves were totally something that existed. And I also thought that wolves were like fully native to New Zealand. Incorrect information that you don't know when you're like a dumbass little kid. But werewolf stories had always been really interesting to me. And there was a movie that I mentioned earlier, Mad Monster Party, which is the stop motion animation from Rankin and Bass. They're the people who did like the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer stop motion animation. And in the movie Elf, where there's like the narwhal pops out of the water, that's kind of in tribute to them. It's also the movie where they did the MASH, they did the Monster MASH came from, right? So anyway, a lot of connections there. But in that movie, they have all these different movie monsters, classic movie monsters, if you will, come to an island for sort of like an inheritance party. It's a super weird film. Highly recommend it. If you can't find a physical copy, I'm pretty sure there's a few rips that are fairly good on YouTube. But even the werewolf, the Wolfman character was like a minor role in that, but I was always drawn to wherever the wolf character was. And there weren't that many female werewolves in popular culture growing up. So I was always gravitating towards werewolf stories, but then also hunting down every female-centric one. Like Kelly Armstrong's Bitten, I was obsessed with. Even what is her name? Patricia Briggs's series, the Mercy Thompson series. She's like a were-coyote, but tomato. It's like for many purposes inherently the same type of creature, like an animal or like a monstrous ability that you can shift into. Things like Ginger Snaps and the werewolves in Buffy, and that was always something that I was really always captivated by. And I just like the idea of a physicalness to the power that always like was very interesting to me. And so as I moved on later in the series of books, trying to write characters who don't have supernatural abilities that are so overt was a challenge, because I'm like, how do you make that interesting for the reader? Like I started with the monster that I loved the most, which was werewolves, and then and it's so like, and they turn into a big bloody wolf, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, they're a wolf now. Like, it's very straightforward, like, in theory. But then how do you, if you're a witch or you're a medium, like, how are you, if you've got to tell the person how that works, and rather than show them, you don't have the ability to show like you would on screen. So that became a challenge, but also a really interesting challenge, because then it's like, Witcher Court of Death onwards, you've got Sadie Burke, who's a banshee, and her sisters are banshees, and then you have Dreckley Jones, who's a sprite, who has specific abilities relating to air and things like that. So it's like, by the time I get to Rose Daughter, I've had a lot of practice, but shit, that first like Witcher Court of Death, I was like, oh man, what have I done? Why did I go for, like, I'm trying to go for a power that has like an emotional core, rather than a physical one, and thinking that sounded great, and it did in theory, but like also the actual practicalness of crafting that is really quite challenging.
Yeah. And I'm interested to know, when you were a child growing up, did you have a very big wild imagination? Do people say that you had a...
Yeah, for sure. And I think because I grew up pretty much the only child around, like I was predominantly raised by my grandparents, and there weren't many other kids around. And so it was a lot of time on your own and playing by yourself. And I think a lot of kids who've grown up in like largely adult environments will say the same sort of thing. Like, I would always, I was a big Barbie kid, like I was mad into my Barbies. So I was always like setting up my Barbies and like having different scenarios. And at night, I'd always look forward to going to sleep, because I would have like fun new stories that I would be crafting in my head as like little daydreams and things to myself. I could pretty much play with anything, like forks and spoons, or like creating little people out of like chip packets and stuff like that. It was always something that I loved doing. I often wonder, like, you have those conversations with your friends, and they're like, oh, what would you do if you like didn't do this? And I always think, oh man, I'd love to be, I didn't grow up in a pop culturally savvy family, right? So I didn't know when you watched movies that you could make movies. And now in hindsight, I'm like, well, if I knew what I know now back then, a production designer would have been a job that I would have loved, because I get to combine things that I enjoy doing and thrive doing, like research and, in-depth nosing around, but also getting to do like practical art things. But at the same time, I wonder if if that had been my career path, if I would really miss that sort of Barbie playing, that play, because that's what it is. It's play. Like, I think I would probably really miss that, even in, like, if I never had another book published ever again, or I never, worked in any capacity where people read my work, I would always write stories, even if they were just for myself, because getting to build them and get lost in them is so much fun. I find it so endlessly rewarding. Even before this, I was working on I was supposed to be doing script revisions for a thing, and I was like, okay, cool, like I'll set my alarm for this time, and I'll go like, throw a face on and like wake your tits into a bra and off you go. And I was just like so wrapped up in the story and so wrapped up in the characters that my alarm went off, and I kind of like missed it. And then like 10 minutes later, it went off again. I was like, shit, like I, like, fully like, oh my God, here we are. And I like then had to scream like, here's the hair and the, whoa, who knows? I'm wearing pajama pants. You can't see that. But if I had like listened to my first alarm, I'd have real pants on right now.
That's funny. Karina wonders, where do you start when you begin to world build your settings and your societies?
It's a really good question, and I think a really tough one to answer, because everybody has like a different version of this that works for them. And I've been on so many panels with other authors, in particular, who are fantasy or sci-fi authors, and we get asked this question a lot. And so I've listened to a lot of other people's answers. So I can only explain it, I guess, from my specific point of view. But usually I'm starting with a very small story, and I'm never starting with the world first. Usually I have a small story. And in the case of all of this, it was about a woman in her 20s wanting to learn about who she was, wanting to learn who her father was, which is an extremely personal and relatable story to me at the time. And, okay, so what if her family, like her blood family, are part of this supernatural world, and what if, it's all this like sort of transgression and genre play and stuff from there. And so then you establish, okay, it's this person's journey into this world, and everything is from their perspective and through their lens. And then the next book, it's a little bit bigger, and it's a little bit bigger, and it's a little bit bigger. And I think the tricky thing with world building is you build it, right? You build so much of it. So you kind of have this inherent want to have everybody know as much as you know immediately, and then be like, okay, so this thing's there and this thing, yeah, and you can't go out, blah, blah, blah. All right, you got that, yeah, okay, cool. And here's the story. But the skill is to sort of sprinkle that information out slowly over the course of a story, so that it feels really authentic, and then it feels like with every page or with every sentence or with every chapter, it's like a black and white picture at the very start of the story. And your aim as a storyteller should be like you're coloring it in. So by the end of the story, whether it's a short story or whether it's a book or whatever, that picture should be all different colors, and it should add depth and tone. And that is sort of the intent. Like, I don't know if I answered her. Sorry, Karina. If I answered. Is it Karina? Was that who asked the question?
Karina.
Okay, great. I'm sorry if I didn't answer that question super well, but it's
no, I think you've given
you've
given us an idea on what you do. So from that, how you've answered that, what I'm wondering now then is, when you are creating your world, is it all in your mind, or do you like, if what it looks like? I know you're writing the story and that, but do you draw anything, or?
Yeah, I have a very dodgy notebook that you'll never see, that I had a lot of, especially in the early books, when I would sometimes have trouble describing characters or sort of like manifesting them in that way. I'm a very visual person, so oftentimes I would sketch characters and sketch different places and how that might look badly, but it still was like a process for me. But it was also just something that was like kind of helpful. And now I'm in the position where like I have a readership, and they have people who've read the books from, X amount of time, and so they send you fan art, or they'll like, deliver a poster or something that they've drawn. And I always find it so interesting and fascinating how different people perceive the same. Like, it's like you have a set of instructions for building furniture, and everybody interprets that a little bit differently. And that's kind of like when you see other people's art and you're like, wow, that's amazing. They've really captured whatever the essence is of that character in a specific way. And I find that really intriguing. Like, you can't really tell right now because my desk is like further at the back, but it's covered in art that people have drawn for me of the different characters. And you wouldn't even necessarily think that some of those characters is from the same book, but the way people visually interpret them, I think is really fascinating to me.
Yeah. Belinda's wondering if you have any writing rituals.
Writing rituals. I'm quite time poor, so I've never had too many rituals, that is to say, like a set thing that I have to do, because it's usually like whatever avenue of time I can cram writing into is when I would cram writing into. But if I'm for a book specifically, like if I'm on a book deadline, and this is such a luxury because I realize like not everybody has lives like this, like there's a reason why I don't have children, but I want to give like a big chunk of time. Like I need at least like 4 hours, otherwise I'm like, like why bother? I get a lot of good writing, I should say pre-pandemic, get a lot of good writing done on planes, but oftentimes it would be like whenever I can just get to it, I just get to it, and I just can do what I can do. But my biggest writing ritual is like, I just want a block of time. Like, I really want a decent chunk of time to be able to get into some stuff, and also want a cup of tea. A cup of tea is preferable, but like, I'll take whatever you got.
And could you tell us what you've been reading lately, and if maybe there's something you'd like to recommend to us?
I would love to. You preempted me on this question, so I had answers, which is good, because then I would have done, that panic thing when you're expecting a question and someone's suddenly like, what's your favorite color? And you're like, I don't know, mustard? And then 10 minutes later, you're like, I hate the color mustard. Why did I say that? So I've been trying to with pandemic times, I've been enjoying the sort of guarantee of a happy ending. And I've been trying to read more romance novels. That's not a genre that I was super familiar with. And a really good friend of mine and a fellow author, Dr. Jodie McAllister, is one of the world's leading experts in romance novels. She wrote a really great series, the Valentine series, which is amazing and has the books Ironheart and Misrule in it as well. Highly recommend. But she's like my go-to for romance book recommendations because she's literally a doctor in it, right? So I'll be like, these are the things, because I have very specific things. Like, I don't want any mean shit. I don't want people being mean to each other. I can't handle it. I get anxious. I get nervous. I don't want any lies. Like, you know, they're a secret cop or something. I'm like, oh, no, I'm going to get too stressed. So I always give her specifics of like the stuff that I'm after. And so she recommended to me the London Celebrity series from Lucy Parker, which begins with Act Like This, Pretty Face, Making Up, the Austen Playbook, and Headliners. I've read, I think, 3 or 4 of the books in that series, and I really, really loved them. They were, you know, really original setting, really funny, like so just amazingly witty, clever dialogue. I also really loved, it's called Love Lettering by Kate Claiborne, which I thought was really enjoyable. Second First Impressions by Sally Thorne. I love Sally Thorne. I think she's such a smart, clever writer. Also, the Danny Brown series. I'm not sure what the series is called more broadly, but it's like, take a hint. Sorry, Talia Hibbett's series of sisters. The Brown sisters, I think it might be called, but it's Take a Hint, Danny Brown, Get a Life, Chloe Brown.
Yes, I think I've read.
And
Yeah.
Alexis Darius, You Had Me at Holler, which I really liked. There's some good books out there. I've really enjoyed dipping into the romance world. It's like very fun to sort of catch up on a genre when it's very fully formed. Like all the tricky years are out of the way. You can just skip all the Fabio years and go straight to the good shit.
Thanks for those recommendations. We've got a few people who said they love the Valentine series.
So good. It's such
I'll have to have a look at that one.
They're amazing. Very scary. This is her sales pitch because often Jodie and I are on the same circuit and we'll be seated near each other and we're good mates in real life. So her pitch is always small towns, smart girls, murder fairies. That's like it in 6 words. And it is genuinely really scary, but also the characters are really smart and the world building's really great. And the sort of main character of Pearl is very nuanced type of teenager that you don't see in much sort of speculative fiction. Highly recommend those.
Yeah, thanks for those recommendations. And just reminding people before we finish, if you do have any more questions for Maria, please type them in comments and you'll have a chance to win a copy of The Rose Daughter. Thanks to
free book. It's great if it's free, because if you hate it, then you didn't pay for it. So
I'm sure people won't hate it though.
You never know.
Could you tell us what you like doing when you're not writing and reading?
It's going to sound so lame, but literally just hanging out with friends. I think after a year of, you know, spending most of 2020 in Melbourne and having lockdown for 5 months, and we're currently in lockdown right now and intermittent lockdowns, I always appreciated physical time, like spending time with people that I care about. But I think the past years made me appreciate that more than ever. Like I really just, that's my favorite thing to do if I don't have to work, is to just spend time with other people and just to watch stuff. Like I have to consume a lot of films for my job and spend a lot of time watching movies, and I've always had to as part of, you know, being an entertainment writer and stuff like that as well. So just like chilling out and watching movies, things I haven't seen before. Like I'll go through these waves, I think everybody does it, of they're like, I only want to watch new stuff, or like now I only want to watch comfort watching, or you only want to watch something you've watched 1,000 times before. But like Mayor of Easttown was a show that I think I was like super invested in, and was a show that I was looking forward to every week. In lieu of being able to hang out with physical friends, I hang out with my fake ones, which are Kate Winslet in, I guess, Philly.
And Kelly's wondering if you have any author festivals that you're meant to be attending.
Well, I just finished Supernova Melbourne a few weeks ago, and I was at Supernova Gold Coast before that, Brisbane Writers Festival, and Melbourne Writers Festival. Yes, I'm trying to think. We've done a lot of this stuff digitally, so it's like really quite hard. Like, you know how sometimes if you're there at the physical place, it can be easier to remember, and you're like, oh, yes, okay. But yeah, that sounds like 60%, right? But I'm supposed to be appearing at Supernova Sydney and Supernova Perth coming up at the end of the month. That is obviously border restrictions. Yeah, willing. There are no border restrictions between New South Wales and Vic, but there are between Western Australia and Perth. Yeah. So who knows? But I'll also be appearing at the Brazen Comic Book Festival in October in Sydney. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's all run by women. It's a female orientated and female identifying orientated comic book festival for authors and comic book lovers, comic book creators, comic book artists. There's some amazing women appearing at that, and they have an opportunity at the moment for any Indigenous artists or Indigenous creative teams who want to have a table at the convention and have a mentoring opportunity as well. There's a bunch of stuff available on their website, so I'll be at that in October as well.
So that was was it Brazen?
Brazen. Yeah. You know, like old good broads, they're brazen. I was like, what a good name for a festival, Brazen, you know? Yeah. It's very memorable.
Kelly said her daughter and her friends are really looking forward to seeing you at Supernova.
Oh, that's awful. I really hope I can go. Now, I'll do no border restrictions between New South Wales, baby, so we're good. I'll see you there.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great talking to you. Can you tell people how, I know you said you don't have Facebook, but are there other ways that people can keep in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Movie Maz, but if you just type in Maria Lewis, it will pop up, and I'm on Instagram as well. I deleted Facebook a few years ago, and I deleted a bunch of social media a few years ago. I'm like, all right, I spent too much time on this, you know, and then I deleted it all before a pandemic when you probably, you have a lot of hours to kill, and I'm like, oh man, there's only so many things you can scroll through. Suddenly you're very invested in the weather app, and there's just not enough activity on there.
Well, yeah, thanks so much, and hope we can maybe talk to you again when you have some new books out.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate you, A, reading the book, and B, taking an interest in directly in the world. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's been great. And thanks also to everyone else who's joined in, and we've had some really great questions.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the questions, everyone. They're really good. I've never answered a few of those questions before, so that was really fun.
Oh, well, it's good when people can think of original questions. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Yes, bye. See ya.